The snow was not gentle. It fell in thick, wet flakes, a suffocating curtain of white that clung to the bare branches of the oak trees lining Elm Street and muffled the world in a cold, indifferent silence. For Eleanor Vance, standing on the porch of the small bungalow she had called home for 47 years, the silence was the cruelest part. It was a silence filled with the grunts of two burly men hauling her life onto the frozen lawn. A silence punctuated by the scrape of a cherished armchair's wooden legs against the concrete steps. A silence that echoed the vast emptiness in her chest. She watched as a box of her late husband Frank's paperbacks was unceremoniously dumped atop a pile, the damp snow immediately beginning to warp their covers. Each item they carried out was a severed memory, a piece of her history left to perish in the cold. Her face, etched with the fine lines of 72 years of laughter and loss, was a pale, stoic mask. She would not give them the satisfaction of her tears. Not yet. Inside her thin wool coat, her hands were balled into tight, bloodless fists. The cold seeped through the worn fabric, but it was nothing compared to the ice forming around her heart. Across the street, and next door, and 2 houses down, curtains twitched. She could feel the eyes of her neighbors, the same people she'd shared pleasantries with over picket fences, the same people for whom Frank had fixed screen doors and jump-started cars on frosty mornings. They watched from the warmth of their homes, their silence a form of complicity, a quiet consensus that this was not their problem. A lone sheriff's deputy sat in his idling cruiser at the curb, the exhaust puffing out white clouds that dissolved into the snowy air. He was here to keep the peace, which meant ensuring the process of dismantling a woman's life went on without incident. He stared fixedly at his dashboard, refusing to meet her gaze. He was just doing his job. They were all just doing their jobs. The world was full of people just doing their jobs, Eleanor thought, and it was a world that felt colder than the biting December wind. The arrival of the black sedan was the final indignity. It slid to a halt at the curb, its tires splashing a wave of gray slush onto the sidewalk, narrowly missing the pile of her belongings. Silas Croft emerged from the driver's side, a man insulated from the weather and the world by a thick cashmere overcoat and an even thicker layer of self-satisfaction. He was the landlord, the architect of this misery, the man who held the deed to her past and her future. He strode toward her, his expensive leather shoes crunching on the snow-dusted walkway, a smug, proprietary air about him. He held a sheaf of papers, a legal shield for his moral bankruptcy. The scene was set. A frail woman, a pile of frozen memories, a silent audience, and the man who was about to deliver the final, crushing blow. The snow kept falling, a relentless witness to the quiet humiliation unfolding on Elm Street. Silas Croft stopped a few feet from Eleanor, his breath misting in the frigid air. He held up the eviction notice as if it were a trophy. "Eleanor," he began, his voice smooth and condescending, loud enough for the deputy to hear clearly. "As you know, we've been over this. The paperwork is all in order. It's unfortunate it had to come to this, but business is business." He made a small, dismissive gesture toward the growing mountain of her possessions. He saw a pile of junk. She saw the topography of her marriage, the artifacts of a shared life. Eleanor's gaze remained steady, fixed on a point just over his shoulder. She would not grant him the engagement he craved. "I understand, Mr. Croft," she said, her voice quiet but not frail. It was the voice of a woman who had buried a husband and weathered more storms than he could possibly imagine. Its lack of hysteria seemed to irritate him. He had come expecting a scene, perhaps some satisfying hysterics, a woman begging for mercy. Her dignity was an affront to his power. "Good," he clipped, his smile tightening. "I'm glad you're being sensible." He took a step closer, lowering his voice into a more personal, venomous register. "You know, if Frank had been a bit more forward-thinking, a better provider, perhaps you wouldn't be in this predicament. A man should take care of his wife. Even after he's gone," the words struck her with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't the eviction, the cold, or the loss of her home that finally cracked her composure. It was the casual desecration of Frank's memory. Frank, who worked his hands to the bone. Frank, who valued a good name over a full bank account. Frank, whose only failing was a heart too big for his own good. From inside his car, the deputy flinched, a flicker of discomfort crossing his face before being replaced by practiced neutrality. Across the street, a curtain fell shut. The insult hung in the air, sharp and poisonous. Eleanor felt a hot surge of anger, a protective fire for the man she had loved. Her knuckles, hidden in her coat pockets, turned white. She could still smell the scent of grease and sawdust that always clung to Frank's clothes, a scent of honest labor and quiet contentment. Croft's words were a stain on that memory. "You have until sunset to remove your property from the curb," Croft continued, his tone returning to its officious chill. He glanced at the sky, a theatrical gesture. "After that, it's considered abandoned, and the city will dispose of it. I'd hurry if I were you." He gave her one last look, a mixture of pity and contempt, then turned his back on her. He walked back to his warm car, leaving Eleanor standing in the snow, the echo of his cruelty colder than any winter gust. The conflict was no longer about money or a house. It had become a battle over the sanctity of a good man's name and the resilience of the woman who was its sole keeper. The lock on her front door clicked shut with a terrible finality, and Silas Croft drove away, leaving her utterly alone. As the taillights of Croft's sedan disappeared into the swirling snow, Eleanor's mind unspooled, retreating from the harsh present into the warm, sunlit rooms of the past. This house wasn't just wood and plaster. It was a living album of her life with Frank. She saw him standing in the doorway on the day they moved in, his face beaming, a smear of paint on his cheek. "We did it, Ellie," he'd said, lifting her over the threshold. Our own little piece of the world. Frank Vance was a man made of bedrock principles and quiet kindness. A Vietnam veteran who came home with no parades but with an unshakable sense of duty. He opened a small auto repair shop on the edge of town. Vance's garage, the sign, which he'd painted himself, was simple and honest, just like him. He had a gift for machinery, a sixth sense for what made an engine sputter or a transmission grind. But his real gift was for people. He'd fix a neighbor's car and accept a jar of homemade jam as payment. He'd stay late to help a stranded traveler, never charging for the extra hours. "A man's character ain't measured by the money in his pocket," he used to tell her, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. "It's measured by the help he gives when no one's watching." They hadn't been wealthy, but they had been rich in ways Silas Croft would never comprehend. Their wealth was in the Sunday morning breakfasts, the smell of coffee brewing while jazz played on the old turntable. It was in the garden they tended together, the summer evenings spent on the porch swing, watching fireflies dance in the twilight. Then Frank got sick. The diagnosis came like a thief in the night, stealing their future piece by piece. The medical bills mounted into a mountain of debt they could never hope to climb. That was when Silas Croft had appeared, a vulture circling, disguised as a savior. He'd presented them with a reverse mortgage, speaking in a confusing dialect of amortization and equity. "It's a way to access the value in your home, Eleanor," he had purred, guiding her hand as she signed the papers. Frank was too weak to protest, and she, lost in a fog of fear and grief, had trusted him. She didn't understand the predatory terms, the ballooning interest, the clauses written in microscopic print that were a legal tripwire. After Frank passed, the trap snapped shut. Croft's insult about Frank being a poor provider was the ultimate lie. Frank had provided everything that mattered: love, security, a moral compass. He had provided a life of dignity. As the snow began to cake on the shoulders of her coat, Eleanor remembered one of Frank's last lucid conversations. He'd gripped her hand, his own feeling fragile as a bird's wing. "Dignity, Ellie," he'd whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "It's the one thing they can't take from you. Not unless you give it away." Standing there, dispossessed and shivering, she clung to that word. Dignity. It was the last piece of Frank she had left to defend. Croft could take her house, her possessions, her security. But he could not take that. It was her shield, her inheritance, the final unbreakable link to the honorable man she had loved. The two movers, their faces impassive, carried the last of her life out of the house. It was a small wooden box containing their wedding album and a handful of framed photographs. Frank in his army uniform, proud and impossibly young. The two of them on their 25th anniversary, smiling into the camera. A faded snapshot of a baby that had been theirs for only a few precious weeks. The man placed the box gently on top of a dresser, a small, almost imperceptible act of care that stood in stark contrast to the brutality of the day. He and his partner slammed the truck's rear door, the sound booming in the heavy air. One of them walked to the front door and affixed a large, gleaming padlock to the hasp. The metallic click was the sound of a book closing, a life ending. The deputy, a young man named Miller, finally climbed out of his warm cruiser. He approached her with a hesitant, shuffling gait, his hat pulled low against the snow. "Ma'am," he began. His voice soft with a professional pity she found more grating than Croft's open hostility. "Is there somewhere you can go? Family? A friend's house?" "The community shelter is open." Eleanor shook her head slowly, the movement stiff. "I don't have any family left, deputy. And my friends, they have their own troubles. She wouldn't be a burden. Frank had taught her that, too. You stand on your own 2 feet for as long as you can. Miller looked uncomfortable, his gaze shifting from her face to the pathetic pile of belongings on the curb, then to the silent houses around them. He knew, as she did, that behind those windows were people who owed Frank and Eleanor a debt of gratitude. There was Mrs. Gable from next door. Eleanor had nursed her through the flu last winter, bringing her homemade soup every day. There was Mr. Henderson from across the street, a widower himself. Frank had spent an entire Saturday rebuilding the engine of his ancient lawnmower, refusing any payment. Their silence was a betrayal, a collective shrugging of shoulders that left her utterly exposed. The pressure was not just the cold or the impending darkness. It was the crushing weight of this abandonment. She felt like a ghost, invisible to the community she had been a part of for nearly 5 decades. The snow continued its relentless assault. It was starting to cover the legs of the rocking chair where she had sung lullabies to a baby long gone. It dusted the glass of the picture frames, blurring the smiling faces within. A single, red mitten, dropped from a box of winter clothes, lay starkly against the white, a small, vibrant wound. Eleanor pulled her thin coat tighter. A shiver ran through her, a deep, cellular tremor that had nothing to do with the temperature. It was the chill of absolute solitude. Yet her spine remained straight. Her chin was up. She stood guard over the wreckage of her life, a solitary sentinel in a storm of indifference. The pressure mounted with every falling flake, with every moment of silence from the houses around her. But she would not break. She would endure. That was her promise to Frank. As the afternoon light began to fade, turning the white landscape a dreary shade of blue-gray, a small movement near the pile of furniture caught Eleanor's eye. A dog, a scruffy terrier mix with matted fur and ribs starkly visible beneath its hide, had crept out from behind a hedge. It moved with a nervous, hesitant energy, whining softly as it sniffed at the base of a floor lamp. It was a creature as lost and forgotten as she felt, a fellow traveler in a world that had turned its back. The deputy had finally driven away, his duty to keep the peace fulfilled. The neighbors' windows were dark, their curiosity sated or their guilt too heavy to bear. The street was empty, save for her, the dog, and the falling snow. Eleanor watched the animal tremble, a constant, violent shiver that shook its small frame. It looked up, its dark, intelligent eyes meeting hers for a fleeting moment, a spark of shared misery passing between them. In that moment, it wasn't just a stray dog. It was a kindred spirit. Slowly, so as not to startle it, Eleanor knelt on the cold, wet ground. The dampness immediately soaked through the thin fabric of her trousers, but she barely noticed. She reached into the deep pocket of her coat and her fingers found a small, foil-wrapped package. It was a sandwich, ham and cheese on white bread, the last of the food in her house. She had packed it that morning, a practical act in the face of chaos, thinking she might need it later. Later was now. With stiff, cold fingers, she carefully unwrapped the sandwich. The dog watched her every move, its tail giving a hopeful, tentative wag. She broke off a corner of the bread and cheese and held it out on her palm. The dog darted forward, snatched the morsel with a surprising gentleness, and gulped it down. Eleanor offered another piece and then another. She didn't stop until the entire sandwich, her last meal, was gone. The dog licked its lips and nudged her hand, looking for more. She had nothing else to give it except for one thing. Without a second thought, she unwound the knitted scarf from around her neck. It was a deep forest green, the color of Frank's eyes, and he had given it to her on their last Christmas together. It was imbued with his memory, still holding the faint scent of his favorite tobacco. She leaned forward and gently, loosely, tied the warm wool around the dog's neck. The creature stood perfectly still, as if it understood the gravity of the gift. "There now," Eleanor whispered, her voice cracking with an emotion she hadn't allowed herself all day. "At least one of us should be warm." She gave the dog a final, gentle pat on its head. It was a small, seemingly insignificant act in the grand scheme of her tragedy, an act of pure, selfless compassion. She had nothing, and yet she gave. This small, quiet act of kindness was not entirely without a witness. Leo, the younger of the two movers, was walking back to the company truck, his mind already on a hot meal and forgetting the unpleasantness of the day. He was 24, jaded by a job that often put him face to face with human hardship, and he had learned to build a wall around his heart to get through the day. He'd seen the eviction with professional detachment. It was just another job, another set of boxes, another sad story. But then he saw it. He saw the old woman, the one they just put out on the street, kneeling in the snow. He saw her give her own food to a stray dog. He saw her take the scarf from her neck and wrap it around the shivering animal. Something inside him cracked. The wall he'd so carefully constructed crumbled. This wasn't just some tenant who couldn't pay her bills. This was a woman who, in the moment of her greatest loss and humiliation, chose kindness. She chose to comfort another living being. A hot wave of shame washed over Leo. He was part of this. His hands had carried her memories out into the cold. He stopped by the cab of the truck where his boss was finishing up some paperwork. "This ain't right, man," Leo said, his voice low and tight. What we just did, his boss, a heavy-set man named Carl, didn't even look up. "It's a job, kid. Don't get soft. Get in the truck," but Leo couldn't move. The image of the woman and the dog was burned into his mind. He pulled out his battered smartphone, his fingers numb with cold. He scrolled through his contacts, past friends and family. To a name listed only as Prez, he hesitated for only a second before pressing the call button. The voice that answered was like gravel churning in a cement mixer. "Yeah, Prez, it's Leo," he said, turning away from the truck for privacy. "I'm on a job in Northwood. There's this woman. They're evicting her. An old lady. Throwing all her stuff out in the snow." He spoke quickly, the words tumbling out. He described the smug landlord, the indifferent deputy, the silent neighbors. And then his voice softened. "But the thing is, I just saw her. She's got nothing left. And she's out there, kneeling in the snow, feeding her last sandwich to a stray dog. She even gave it her own scarf." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Leo rushed to fill it. "Her name is Eleanor Vance. Her husband, he's passed on. Frank Vance. He used to run a garage out on the highway. Army vet." The name hung in the air. After a moment, the gravelly voice spoke a single, resonant word. "Where?" Leo rattled off the address on Elm Street. The call ended. A shift had occurred. A whisper of respect, born from a simple act of compassion, was now traveling across phone lines, awakening a force the quiet suburban street was utterly unprepared for. An hour bled into the next. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the world was plunged into the deep, bruised purple of a winter twilight. The streetlights flickered on, casting lonely pools of orange onto the snow-blanketed street. Eleanor remained by her belongings, a solitary statue carved from grief and resilience. The little dog huddled at her feet, a small, warm presence in the vast cold. The deputy was long gone. The street was deserted. The silence returned, deeper and more profound in the darkness. Then, a sound began. It was a low, distant thrum, a vibration felt more than heard, as if the earth itself were clearing its throat. It grew steadily, resolving itself from a general rumble into the distinct, syncopated rhythm of V-twin engines. It wasn't one engine. It was many, dozens. The sound swelled, a guttural roar that rolled down the hills and filled the narrow street, vibrating in the windows of the silent houses and in Eleanor's own chest. Curtains were pulled back again, this time with a nervous, fearful energy. Over the crest of the hill at the far end of Elm Street, a single, piercingly bright headlight appeared. It was followed by two more, then four, then a whole constellation of them, a wave of light and sound cresting the hill and preparing to crash down on their quiet world. They came in a disciplined V formation, a procession of chrome and black leather. Harley-Davidsons, Fat Boys, Road Kings, their powerful engines thundering in unison. The men who rode them were large and imposing, their faces set like stone beneath their helmets, their shoulders broad in leather cuts emblazoned with the unmistakable, notorious patch of the Hells Angels. They didn't tear down the street with reckless speed. They advanced with a slow, deliberate, terrifying authority. The sound was an announcement, a proclamation of presence that shattered the suburban quiet. They rolled past Eleanor, their headlights briefly illuminating her pale, astonished face. But they didn't stop. They continued down the street, one by one, and then, in a synchronized, shockingly audacious move, they turned. They turned onto the pristine, snow-covered lawn of Silas Croft's oversized modern house 2 doors down. One after another, they drove onto his perfect grass, their heavy tires carving deep tracks in the snow. Kickstands were deployed with a series of sharp, metallic clanks. Engines were cut, one by one, the roar subsiding into an even more menacing silence. In less than 2 minutes, 100 motorcycles were parked on Silas Croft's lawn, an occupying army of leather, chrome, and iron, their riders standing silent and watchful in the encroaching night. The Brotherhood had arrived. The front door of Silas Croft's house flew open, spilling a rectangle of bright, warm light onto the violated snow of his lawn. He stormed out onto his porch, his face a mask of crimson fury, his cashmere coat flapping around him. "What in God's name is the meaning of this?" he shrieked, his voice thin and reedy against the heavy silence. "This is private property. Get off my lawn. I'm calling the police." From the center of the silent assembly of bikers, one man stepped forward. He was immense, a mountain of a man with a thick, graying beard that covered most of his chest and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. The patch on his vest read President. He moved with a calm, unhurried grace that was more intimidating than any overt threat. He stopped at the edge of the porch, looking up at the sputtering landlord. "We're not here to talk about your lawn," the president said, his voice a low growl that seemed to make the air vibrate. "We're here about Frank Vance." Croft blinked, his anger momentarily short-circuited by confusion. "Frank Vance? He's dead. We know he's dead," the biker said, his eyes narrowing. "Frank Vance was a friend of the club. Not a member, but a friend. An ally. When our bikes broke down on some godforsaken highway, he'd show up with his truck and a smile. He'd fix a cracked head for the price of the parts and a handshake. He came to our charity toy runs every Christmas with a trunk full of donations. He was a man of honor. The kind of man you wouldn't understand." Just then, Leo, the young mover, appeared at the edge of the growing crowd of neighbors who had crept out of their houses, drawn by the spectacle. His voice shaking but clear, he pointed a finger at Croft. "I saw what you did today. I saw you throw her out. And then I saw her, with nothing left, give her last bit of food to a second biker." His face scarred and weathered, stepped forward. "About 5 years ago, my bike's engine seized on I-84. Middle of the night. Frank picked me up, drove me to his home. Mrs. Vance," he nodded his head respectfully across the street toward Eleanor. "She made me a hot meal while Frank stayed up all night rebuilding my carburetor. They wouldn't take a cent. Just told me to pay it forward. The dam of silence broke. One by one, others spoke. Another biker told a story of Frank co-signing a loan for him to get his own small business started. Then the neighbors, shamed into courage by the biker's fierce loyalty, found their voices. Mr. Henderson, his voice thick with emotion, spoke of the countless times Frank had fixed his tools for free. A woman from down the block confessed that Frank and Eleanor had anonymously paid for her son's winter coat one year. The reveal was not just about Frank. It was a tapestry of a life well lived, a testament to the quiet, daily acts of grace and decency that he and Eleanor had woven into the fabric of the community. A fabric Silas Croft had tried to tear apart for profit. The president, a man they called Stone, turned his gaze away from the now silent and pale Silas Croft. He looked across the street to where Eleanor stood, a small, solitary figure illuminated by the glow of a street lamp, the little dog still at her side. For a moment, the hard, unyielding lines of his face seemed to soften. With a gravitas that commanded the attention of every person on the street, he walked across the road, the snow crunching under his heavy black boots. The sea of bikers and neighbors parted for him, creating a silent path. He came to a stop in front of Eleanor. He towered over her, a giant of leather and denim, and she, in her worn coat, looked impossibly fragile. But her eyes were clear, and for the first time that day, they held not just sorrow, but a flickering spark of wonder. Stone didn't offer words of comfort or promises. Words were cheap. Instead, he performed a simple, profound gesture. He slowly pulled off his own thick, fleece-lined leather gloves, revealing hands calloused and scarred from a life of hard riding and harder living. He held them out to her. "Your hands are cold, ma'am," he said, his gravelly voice imbued with a startling gentleness. Eleanor looked down at the offered gloves, then back up at his weathered face. The tears she had so stoically held back all day finally welled in her eyes, not tears of sadness, but of overwhelming, unexpected grace. She nodded, unable to speak, and slipped her small, frozen hands into their profound warmth. Stone gave a short, sharp nod, then turned back to his men. "All right," he commanded, his voice once again a powerful rumble. "Let's get her home." The order was a lightning strike. Instantly, the silent army moved with purpose. A half-dozen bikers marched to Eleanor's front door. One produced a massive pair of bolt cutters from a saddlebag and, with a single satisfying snap, severed Croft's shiny new padlock. The door swung open. The rest of the men, now joined by a surge of guilt-ridden and newly emboldened neighbors, descended on the pile of belongings. They moved with a reverence that was breathtaking to witness. Frank's armchair was lifted by 4 men as if it were a throne. The box of photographs was passed hand to hand with the care one would afford to a holy relic. Meanwhile, a few bikers who seemed to know their way around a toolbox disappeared inside the house. Within minutes, the sound of a furnace kicking to life rumbled from within, followed by the clang of a wrench on a pipe. They weren't just moving her back in. They were restoring her sanctuary, piece by piece. Stone, flanked by 10 of his most formidable-looking brothers, walked back onto Croft's lawn and cornered him against his own front door. He didn't raise his voice or a hand. He just stood there, an immovable object of righteous fury. "You're going to tear up that predatory mortgage," Stone stated, not asked. "You're going to sign the deed to her house over to her, free and clear. And you're going to write her a check for pain and suffering. Our chapter treasurer, who happens to be a forensic accountant, will be in your office at 9 a.m. tomorrow to oversee the transfer. You will find he is very persuasive." The threat was unspoken but absolute. For Silas Croft, the world had just been irrevocably, terrifyingly rearranged. Within an hour, the small bungalow on Elm Street was transformed. The last piece of furniture was settled into its familiar place, the pictures rehung on the walls. A cheerful fire crackled in the hearth, its warmth chasing the last of the chilling dampness from the room. The low, steady hum of the newly serviced furnace was a comforting reassurance against the winter night. The kitchen counter was laden with offerings from the community. Warm casseroles, loaves of fresh bread, blankets, and tearful, heartfelt apologies. The silence of the afternoon had been replaced by a quiet, purposeful hum of restoration. Eleanor stood in the center of her living room, a space that had been stolen and was now returned, more whole than before. She was surrounded by the quiet, respectful presence of the bikers, who moved about her home with a surprising delicacy, their large frames seeming to fill the space not with menace, but with a profound sense of safety. The stray terrier, whom she had already decided to name Frankie, was curled contentedly on a braided rug before the fire, its new green scarf a vibrant splash of color. Stone approached her one last time as his men began to quietly file out. He pressed a small, folded piece of paper into her hand. It held a phone number. "This is my personal cell," he said, his voice low. "You are not alone anymore, Mrs. Vance. The club looks after its own family. Anything you need, a leaky roof, a ride to the store, anything. You call this number. Day or night." He then reached into a pocket of his leather vest and pulled out a small, embroidered patch. It wasn't a club insignia. It was a simple, elegant design. A silver wrench and a silver hammer crossed over each other. "We had this made for Frank a few years back," Stone explained, his gaze distant for a moment. "To thank him. Never got the chance to give it to him. It's an honor patch. It belongs to you now." He placed the small, stiff piece of fabric into her palm. Felt heavy, freighted with meaning. It was more than a patch. It was a shield, a symbol of her new, unspoken status as one of them. Protected. The bikers mounted their motorcycles, which still stood as silent sentinels on Croft's ruined, tire-tracked lawn. One by one, the engines roared back to life, the sound thundering through the night. But it was different now. It was not a sound of invasion or intimidation. It was a chorus of allegiance, a 100-engine salute, a promise of unwavering guardianship. They pulled off the lawn, formed their powerful V, and rode off into the darkness, their taillights a receding constellation of red stars. The final, lingering image was of Eleanor Vance, standing at her living room window, her warm home glowing behind her. She held the small patch in one hand, its threads cool against her skin. Outside, the snow had finally stopped falling. The world was quiet, still, and blanketed in a pristine white peace. Inside her home, Eleanor was safe. She was warm, and for the first time since Frank had gone, she felt the unshakable certainty that she belonged. The quiet dignity she had refused to surrender had been her armor, and in the end, it had summoned her angels.